Hi everyone, Janelle here. I'm a functional nutritionist and doctor of natural medicine. This is my podcast where we talk about midlife wellness in the mountains. Today I sat down with my first male guest, so you know he must be special, and I have been a huge fan of his for years. Kiran Krishan is a research microbiologist that specializes in the microbiome. Kiran has published clinical trials in peer-reviewed scientific journals and has several global patents in his name. Kiran is a well-known speaker and is incredible at breaking down complex physiology in a way that everyone can understand. We discuss several of the ways the microbiome directly impacts our hormones and how our microbiome affects all sorts of midlife symptoms and health. I know you will learn a ton from Kiran, and I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I did. Welcome, everybody, and welcome, Kiran. I have been a huge fan of yours for a long time, and I'm super happy to have you here to discuss the microbiome and how it impacts hormones, especially because so many of our listeners are in midlife and things are getting a little bit wonky. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. The women I work with know how important the microbiome is for health, but I do think they're often surprised when they discover how many ways it impacts hormones and even how we can experience perimenopause and menopause. So I was looking through some PubMed research papers before our talk, and I actually came across the phrase microbiome sex hormone axis. And I hadn't actually heard that before, but it was about how the microbiome impacts our hormones and also how our changing hormones at midlife change our microbiome. So there's that double side of the coin. So to start, how many times have you had to explain what a microbiome is, Kiran?
I would guess 432,000 times.
Okay, I'm not going
That's
to
my
have you
rough
do
guess.
that. I'm not going to have you define it. So hopefully that's good. So can we start off by speaking into the microbiome and how it impacts hormone detoxification?
Yeah. So the detoxification process is really interesting, and it's like detoxification from anything. It involves the gut, and then of course it involves the liver as well. So they both kind of go hand in hand to function to try to excrete and get rid of things from the body. So if you take a look at estrogen, for example, the primary mode of detox to reduce and excrete estrogen once it's utilized the way the body needs it is that estrogen is sent to the liver where it's conjugated, and the conjugation just means that there's a chemical cap put on it, so it doesn't look like estrogen anymore, and it doesn't bind estrogen receptors and so on. And then it gets excreted into the gut, where there's a group of microbes, a constellation of microbes called estrobolome, that either remove the cap if there's a balance issue where more estrogen needs to be reabsorbed, or it will metabolize and break down estrogen so that it can be excreted out of the body. Now, what seems to be very clear is that a low diversity in the gut microbiome affects the function of estrobolome, and then high levels of pathogenic organisms also impact the function of estrobolome. So, but it does it in slightly different ways. So, estrobolome being this constellation of numerous microbes, some of which can increase the reabsorption of estrogen, some of which help get rid of estrogen. Where we tend to see the changes is that if you have higher amounts of pathogens, you tend to get more microbes that produce an enzyme called glucuronidase, which then removes that cap, the chemical cap, and allows you to reabsorb estrogen, in fact, too much. And that drives the most common hormone dysfunction, estrogen dominance. If you have higher diversity, you control the pathogens and you get more of the microbes that allow estrogen to actually be removed adequately from the gut. And so there's a very interesting balance there in terms of wanting to reabsorb a certain amount of estrogen, but then also needing to get rid of it so that you can actually go through your proper cycle.
I love how you phrase the cap. It just makes it so clear how the liver, you get the cap and then the microbes. And those are postbiotics, right? What the microbes are making cause that decapping,
That
we'll
enzyme.
call it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like cloaking the estrogen. So, hey, it doesn't look like estrogen anymore. Your body won't recognize it as estrogen, so it can be excreted versus kind of decloaking it and going, haha, it is estrogen, and it's going to get reabsorbed and reutilized in the body. And that's such a important aspect of it because you can actually adjust these functions based on diet, right? So, for example, if you are estrogen dominant, what you want to do is actually increase the consumption of fermented foods and fiber because that's going to go towards increasing diversity and reducing the number of microbes that actually produce the glucuronidase enzyme that uncaps or uncloaks the estrogen, right? So if you tend to be estrogen dominant, you go, okay, my diet needs to be adjusted to increase fiber intake, increase fermented foods, and actually reducing red meat and reducing fats to a certain degree, right? Now, if you are entering perimenopause or you're menopausal, you're still making estrogen, but your circulating estrogen levels tend to be low. You actually want to reabsorb more estrogen. In that case, you would actually increase your consumption of meat and increase your consumption of fat to a certain degree to try to support the organisms that do produce the glucuronidase. So there's evidence that you can adjust this to a certain degree. And it kind of coincides with as women are hitting perimenopause and menopause, there's a lot of recommendation to start doing more resistance training to try to build more lean muscle mass, right? Improve strength, improve mobility, all of that, because that's a huge benefit across the board. So if you're doing that and you do find that your estrogen levels are too low, estradiol levels are too low, you get big dumps in your estrogen, then it may be a benefit to then increase things like protein intake, meat intake, fat intake as well.
Oh, that's so fascinating because then those two recommendations go hand in hand.
Go
They're
hand in hand,
totally
yeah.
in alignment with
Mhm.
each other. Wow, that's so amazing. I love how
Yeah.
that works. And I also find that in perimenopause, when women's estrogen is first spiking super high and going all over the place and crazy before
Mhm.
it finds that new low, that we really want that diversity in the
Yep,
microbiome to kind of buffer that as well. So,
you do.
yeah.
And it's a self-perpetuating problem because you're described in the beginning of that study you read how fluctuating hormones, of course, can impact the microbiome, and then the microbiome thereby further impacts fluctuating hormones, right? So it's a self-perpetuating cycle. What seems to be clear is as your estrogen levels start becoming more volatile and in general start to go down, that actually reduces the diversity of the microbiome.
Hmm.
Right? Now, there may be a self-correcting mechanism there naturally, right? So if you think about, okay, my estrogen levels are going down, that means I may need to reabsorb more. So maybe that's why part of my diversity reduces to increase the pathogens that will help me reabsorb the estrogen. But the problem is there's a lot of downside to the other to that effect, right? Because that also increases leaky gut. It increases all kinds of chronic low-grade inflammation. So it affects your bones, your heart, your brain, your mood, right? Your HPA axis and all that. That's part of what perpetuates a lot of the symptomology that women experience in perimenopause, which are metabolic symptoms, neurological symptoms, mood symptoms, right? Brain fog, all of those things will become perpetuated by a lowering of diversity. So I think it's critically important generally for women in perimenopause who are either in it or approaching it to really start thinking about the diversity of their microbiome because you already have a natural system activating that's going to reduce diversity. And that reduced diversity is going to make all the symptoms that are unfavorable with perimenopause worse.
Yeah, it was interesting. When I was reading all those PubMed research papers, so many of them said we are finding that the more diversity may decrease symptoms in perimenopause and menopause. This is a
Mhm.
great area for more continued research.
Yeah.
So many of them said that, which I know you are on top of for us. So thank you. So I want to just move into what you were just speaking about a little bit about how when we're in midlife, everything becomes more important
Mhm.
because we're just more wobbly. And
Mhm.
so let's discuss for a minute how leaky gut plays into that. What's
Mhm.
the mechanism? Just so people, you explain this so well, so people can understand how something in their gut can impact all of these different systems in their body and cause
Mhm.
that systemic inflammation.
Yeah, and so let's break it down to number one. I'll talk about how leaky gut creates systemic inflammation and disruption in many organ systems, right? And then we'll talk specifically about how leaky gut affects your brain, which thereby affects mood, cognition, cognitive function, and all that. How it affects, for example, your metabolic health, because then weight gain and all that becomes easier, right? And a bigger problem for women. You start holding more weight, especially in the midsection, more visceral fat, and so on. And then third thing, things like skin that we really care about, right? So all of those things are accelerated. So leaky gut occurs as you start seeing a drop in diversity in the gut microbiome. The intestinal barrier is a dynamically permeable barrier, meaning it has to let lots of things through, but there's many things that it's trying to prevent from entering into the circulatory system. So the things it wants to let through, of course, nutrients, right? Small and large nutrients, amino acids, carbohydrates, sugars, healthy fats, things like that are supposed to go through the lining of the gut from digestion. But then we don't want to let in toxins. We don't want to let in bacterial components, viruses, environmental toxins, and so on. So all those things are supposed to be barred from entering. The thing is, with that dynamic barrier, there are some checks and balances in place to make decisions on what can go through and what cannot. Some of the high level checks are number one, the mucosal lining. So the mucosa, what that helps do is it's think about a thick mucus gel-like structure. It slows down the transit time of things trying to penetrate through the intestinal lining, right? So you have this gel-like structure, it traps things and it slows down the transit time. Now, the benefit there is it gives time for the immune system to detect what's coming through and decide, is that something we want to allow to go through, or is that something we need to neutralize in the mucosal layer itself, right? So that is a very important first step. The second step is as it gets through the mucosa, it goes to the intestinal epithelium. This is a single cell layer thick barrier where the cells are kind of sitting next to each other, almost shoulder to shoulder. And in between them, there are these proteins called tight junction proteins that either allow the cells to open up and open a space or cinch them closed like shoelaces so that the space is closed and things don't pass through. Now, there are things that can also pass through the cell, which is called a transcellular pathway or intracellular pathway, or versus a transcellular pathway, which is in between the cells, right? So there's receptors on that top layer of the cells. There are receptors to detect what's coming through so the cells can open up and close up, and then receptors on the underneath side of this intestinal lining where the blood supply is, or at least the inside of the body is, where there's a lot more immune cells waiting to see if there's something it should attack that shouldn't have come through, right? So there's all these checks and balances. The thing is, all of those systems, right? The scrutiny of things in that mucosal layer, the activation of the immune system there, the tight junction proteins, the transcellular proteins, and then all the immune cells that are functioning on the other side of the barrier, all of those things are dependent on the gut microbiome. We've outsourced so many of the control mechanisms and functions to the microbes that live in that region, starting from training the immune system to understand what it should attack and what it shouldn't attack, coming through that mucosal layer, training the intestinal epithelial cells to express those proteins or not to keep the tight junctions functioning, and then training the immune cells that are on the other side of the barrier of what to look for to neutralize and attack if something went through that wasn't supposed to go through, right? All of those complicated checks and balances are highly dependent on a diverse microbiome and are highly dependent on what we call keystone species. These are really important microbes, as a dozen or so that have been identified as keystone species that not only balance the rest of the microbiome, but play a very important role in the function of the barrier, right? So that's where a dysfunction in the microbiome can start causing problems because you start seeing a dismantling of all those check systems. So now what happens then is either A, and typically both of these things happen, A and B, that I'll describe, but A, the systems falter, and so too many things that shouldn't be going through are going through. That's called a leaky gut. So they're leaking into circulation, and these are things that'll typically cause inflammatory responses throughout the body. And or B, the immune system starts to get confused and starts trying to attack everything that comes in, even the things that it shouldn't be attacking, right? So just think about a disarray happening where you've got guards at a checkpoint, and the guards are supposed to know what is supposed to come through and what is not supposed to come through. They're getting that information from a central command center, an intelligence system, if you will, that shows them what to attack and what not to attack. Imagine that system becomes dysfunctional, so the barriers are starting to fall apart, and the guards are now confused and they just attack everything, right? So what that looks like in the body that we feel is, number one, you get a lot of systemic inflammation because things are leaking through that shouldn't be, triggering immune responses throughout the body. And number two, because your immune system is attacking all kinds of things it's not supposed to, you start becoming very sensitive to things, right? Foods that you used to be able to eat that were perfectly fine, now you can't eat them anymore because they cause GI disturbances, gas, bloating, discomfort, diarrhea, all kinds of things. Those are all indications that your immune system is now attacking things that it shouldn't be attacking, right? So any sort of food sensitivities, allergies, asthma, all those types of sensitivities where your immune system is overreacting is a sign that your immune system's intelligence is falling apart. And it falls apart because the microbiome falls apart, because the microbiome are the eyes and ears of the immune system, trains the immune system, right? So that's essentially what's happening in leaky gut. So you get this double whammy of your immune system going to disarray, not knowing what to attack, what not to attack, and then lots of things leaking through, especially endotoxins. These are toxins that are produced by 50% or so of the microbes that live in your gut. It's called LPS. This endotoxin is supposed to be sequestered in that mucosal lining and removed through defecation. That's now leaking through into the body and wreaking havoc in all different areas, right? So that's leaky gut. Does that make sense in general?
Yeah, it's almost overwhelming because it impacts so many things in our
Mm-hmm.
body, like everything. It's so overwhelming for people, I think important for people to understand that mechanism, how that works.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating what an important boundary our microbiome is, and what an
Mm-hmm.
intelligent, important
Yeah.
boundary it is. And the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking is, so I'm married to a physician,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know when exactly it started changing, but not that long ago, when I would say leaky gut, I go to a lot of functions with
Yeah.
physicians, and they would think I was just crazy.
Totally.
Oh, I roll that there's no, I mean, they would say there's no such thing as leaky gut. And it's amazing how much now we have such great research, thanks to microbiologists like yourself. But it's such a huge mechanism that
It
drives
is.
so many symptoms. And
Yep.
and so I can't believe we didn't know about it for so long, and also how incredibly important it is.
Yeah,
So
now, so doctor, the reason why a lot of medical doctors believed, and many of them still do believe, that it doesn't exist is because this was something that the American College of Gastroenterology or gastroenterologists in general were faced with, right? This was as early as like kind of the late 80s that this kind of information was talked about. In fact, one of the first papers on intestinal permeability that was published was actually published by a biological dentist in the 60s that putting forth this idea that there could be, and of course, nothing about the microbiome was known or anything, but it was a hypothesis that barrier systems like the gums and the lining of the gut could falter and leak through things that could cause inflammation and toxicity throughout the body. Now, when gastroenterologists looked at this, it scared the shit out of them, right? And so they said, well, it couldn't possibly exist because if it did, people would be dying all the time, right? That was the logic behind it, right? And in fact, a friend of mine in this world, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, who's considered to be the father of functional medicine, he talks about his early conversations with gastroenterologists and all that, where they would say it's impossible because people would be dying if there was such a thing as intestinal permeability. And as it turns out, people are dying as a result of it. And in fact, not only are people dying, it's the number one cause of mortality worldwide. There was a meta-analysis paper that was published in 2015, and we didn't even have as much data at 2015 as we do now, where they reviewed a number of studies on this pathology and this process of leaky gut and endotoxemia or chronic low-grade inflammation. And they concluded from all the studies that were available then that it's the number one cause of mortality worldwide because it's the number one driver of chronic disease, right? This is how we can easily connect leaky gut to what's happening to you metabolically, what's happening to your brain, what's happening to your immune system, what's happening to your skin, and so on, right? Because it's a direct effect on all of these systems.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating, and I'm so glad that we have this science. So can we move to metabolic?
Yeah.
How, in again, with the decrease in estrogen, we become less sensitive to insulin and more sensitive to glucose. So how does our microbiome impact our metabolism? I mean, you could list a
Mhm.
million ways, but
Yeah.
just what's the way you can think of that you want to
Well,
explain?
since you brought up glucose, we'll start with that, right? So that's a very, very profound one because it does, as you hit menopause, the risk for type 2 diabetes increases quite dramatically. So, and you made a connection there where as you reduce estrogen, your risk of glucose tolerance goes up, intolerance goes up. And so what's happening there? Well, part of it is leaky gut as well, right? So as you develop reduced diversity, you get more intestinal permeability, you get higher amounts of endotoxemia. Endotoxemia is the presence of LPS endotoxins that should normally be sequestered in the lining of the gut, now found in high concentrations in circulation, right? So that's when I say endotoxemia, that's what I'm referring to. Now, what happens when you have elevated endotoxemia? And this has been published by the American Diabetic Association multiple times, where there's two forms of glucose intolerance that develop. Number one, it's called central insulin resistance. And that's because this endotoxin, this LPS endotoxin, is incredibly pervasive. It can make it to all regions of your body once it leaks through, including the brain. The brain is a very fatty tissue. This endotoxin is a lipid-based tissue, lipid-based compound. So it has an affinity to making it to the brain. And I'll talk about other havoc that it wreaks in the brain. But once it gets to the brain, it can create inflammation in areas like the hypothalamus. When it creates inflammation in areas like the hypothalamus, what it does is it reduces your brain's ability to read your blood sugar levels, right? So this is why it's called central insulin resistance, where your brain, and this is irrespective of body weight. You don't have to be obese. You don't have to be going through all kinds of insulin spikes on a daily basis from eating sugars and cookies and things like that. This is your brain getting inflamed and your brain's inability now to read your blood sugar levels. So your pancreas can't respond appropriately to make enough insulin, and you don't make enough glucagon either when you're low on blood sugar, right? So you can go through these like big peaks and valleys of blood sugar where the blood sugar is too high because your brain doesn't know it's that high and doesn't stimulate insulin production, or your blood sugar drops really low and all of a sudden you're like super fatigued and you can't mobilize your hormones to release glucagon or gluconeogenesis, which is the production of glucose or the metabolization and release of stored glucose in your muscles and in your liver. So you go through these big peaks and valleys of daily insulin levels, right? That's a central insulin resistance. The other part of it is the inflammation that is caused by the presence of endotoxins is the primary insult on the pancreas that causes the islet cells. These are the cells that make insulin to start defaulting and stop making insulin over time, right? So in fact, they have the American Diabetic Association, mind you, and these big research institutes are normally decades behind on new research, but they published as early as 2017, 2018, that the primary insult in insulin resistance and prediabetes is endotoxemia, an elevation in blood LPS levels, that inflammation causes a damage to the pancreatic cells, right? So as your diversity is decreasing, because your estrogen is going down, you're becoming more susceptible to leaky gut, which is increasing chronic low-grade inflammation. That increase in chronic low-grade inflammation is driving central insulin resistance and a direct effect on your pancreas's ability to produce insulin, right? So now you're getting massive dysregulation of insulin response. That alone can drive fat metabolism issues, right? And create more fat storage. On top of that, the LPS has a number of other functions that screw up metabolism. Number one, when LPS leaks through and engages with the adipose tissue in the visceral fat area, so in the midsection, it swells the fat cells, the adipocytes, to 3 times their normal size, right? So women who have never felt, who've always had a flat tummy, and never really gained weight in their tummy, right? Even if they gained weight younger, maybe it'd be on the butt and the hips, or maybe even in the breasts, but now they're getting more of a belly, right? Some of that can be attributed to the swelling of fat cells in the visceral fat area, right? And then of course you're holding it there. And then the other part of it is LPS also causes something called leptin resistance. Leptin is your satiety hormone. Once you eat enough food, leptin's supposed to go up, and then ghrelin, the hunger hormone, is supposed to go down, right? And when leptin goes up, what's supposed to happen is, number one, it's supposed to force you to stop eating so that you could stop eating around 80-90% to fullness, right? And then leptin also triggers systemic activation of fat burning enzymes and signals like AMPK. So what's supposed to happen is when you eat food, presumably you're eating when you're hungry. So that means your ghrelin, your hunger hormone levels are high, right? So you start eating food. As the food makes its way down to the gut, your microbiome metabolizes the food and starts producing things like short chain fatty acids, like butyrate. Butyrate then binds receptors on the lining of the gut. That causes ghrelin to start going down, and leptin, the satiety hormone, to go up. And when leptin goes up and ghrelin goes down, it changes your desire for food, and it causes you to slow down your eating and stop your eating. And then, in fact, when leptin gets high enough, it triggers metabolic pathways to go, okay, guys, we got to get the blood sugar under control, reduce that postprandial peak, and then let's start burning fat for fuel as well, right? So all of those things get disrupted, don't happen. In fact, in the first leaky gut study that we published, we saw this in non-obese individuals that had severe leaky gut. Their ghrelin leptin response was like non-existent, right? They would come into the lab fasted, so they would have a high level of hunger hormone. We'd give them a 2,000 calorie meal, and the hunger hormone levels would barely dip and start going back up again. And then their satiety hormone leptin would hardly go up. And we're going, wow, we fed them as many calories as you would ever want in a meal, and yet their body doesn't recognize it, right? And then we fixed their leaky gut in 30 days. And at the end of the 30 days, when we repeated that study in the same individuals, they would come in fasted, so their ghrelin hormones, their hunger hormone would be high. The moment we gave them a meal, within an hour and a half, boom, the hunger hormone tanks and leptin goes up just from fixing the leaky gut. They didn't do any diet or anything like that. So it's very profound for metabolic health. And it's a thing that makes the perimenopausal and menopausal stage in women's midlife really difficult, because your body doesn't look and feel the way it always used to, right? And those are kind of foreign changes to a lot of women.
Yeah, this is so relevant to the people I work with, because it's amazing how most of the people I work with are eating a pretty healthy diet. They understand nutrition and they're eating a pretty healthy diet, but so many do find that in midlife they get these big metabolic changes. And I run a lot of gut tests on people, and we so often find a massive dysbiosis and leaky gut despite doing so much right. And I don't have tests for this. I'm not a researcher, but I see it all the time, how when people improve their microbiome and heal their gut, like it just, everything comes together and things just work better, and they lose the weight and their energy stabilizes. It's just fascinating to me. Does it ever overwhelm you, Kiran, at how much it impacts? It's just wild.
It is. It's what overwhelms me is the inability to make everybody understand this instantaneously, right?
Yeah.
Because the thing is, if everybody understood this, we could absolutely eradicate the vast majority of chronic conditions, right? Given that the number one driver of chronic disease is intestinal permeability, chronic low-grade inflammation, right? If you think about just that impact alone, that it's the number one cause of death in the developed world, if we just fix leaky gut, we should be able to really alleviate, a lot of chronic disease that people are dealing with when they don't really need to, right? And so yeah, and for women especially, it becomes important because their bodies are changing so radically. And as I mentioned earlier, all of the negative changes are perpetuated by changes in the microbiome, right? So let's take the brain, for example, right? What's happening in the brain? So it's very common for women as they enter into perimenopause and go into menopause to experience a lot of brain fog, a lot of memory recall issues, right? Cognitive dysfunction, and then anxiety and depression is very common as well. So what's the role of leaky gut in that, right? So there's a study called the Netherlands Study on Anxiety and Depression. So this is the country of Netherlands. So it was sponsored by the government, and they're seeing a massive increase in the prevalence rate of anxiety and depression. And so being a nationalized healthcare system, the government's really looking at how do we understand and reduce all these pathologies, because they're trying to save money, right? Because it's very expensive to manage things like anxiety, depression, and then later on cognitive dysfunction like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on. And keep in mind, and this is not to scare people, but just to make people aware that in many ways, what we experience today as anxiety and or depression are very early stages of the pathologies that lead to things like dementia and Alzheimer's, right? Because it's all neuroinflammation in the brain. And then as the brain doesn't recover as fast as it's getting damaged, that leads to accumulation of misfolded proteins and things. People have heard of, alpha-synuclein in Parkinson's, and then amyloid beta in Alzheimer's. The accumulation of those kind of misfolded proteins eventually leads to a neurological pathology that looks like Alzheimer's, dementia, and all that. But the pathways of that happening are exactly the same pathways that cause anxiety and depression, right? So let's unpack that for a moment for people, right? So this endotoxin that I talked about, LPS, it has numerous ways of affecting serotonin and dopamine function in the body. So serotonin being the happy hormone, which is really important for maintaining mood and so on. Dopamine is the reward center of the brain, right? That's the thing that makes us feel good about the things we do that are pleasurable or exciting and so on. And in fact, we live in a society where we're trying to chase dopamine too much, right? That's the whole scrolling, overeating, addiction to things like substances and all that. All that is to try to keep stimulating dopamine. And the falsehood here is that pleasure leads to happiness, right? That's where we really screw things up, because so then what we do is we constantly try to stoke dopamine because it's a temporary pleasure sensation that we misguidedly think leads to happiness. But in fact, too much dopamine negates the function of serotonin, which is what you really need to feel happy, right? So that's a whole other episode on its own. But nonetheless, both are produced by the gut, right? So to have adequate serotonin and dopamine to begin with, you need a healthy, diverse gut. There are cells within your gut called enterochromaffin cells that produce these hormones and neurotransmitters, and most of it is actually produced in the gut, not in the brain, right? So just to have it to function, your gut has to be healthy. On top of not having it because of an unhealthy gut, you also end up with a leaky gut where you've got endotoxins leaking through. And what endotoxins have been shown to be able to do is make its way to the brain and bind itself to dopamine and serotonin receptors in the brain, right? So you're not making adequate amounts. And the amount that you are making, your brain can't utilize well because the endotoxin is sitting there in place of the dopamine or the serotonin compound, right? And so this, going back to this Netherlands study, they were looking at a 9-year follow-up period. They took large cohorts of people that experience anxiety, depression, and so on. They started looking at all kinds of biomarkers in the blood and all that to try to figure out which biomarkers were relevant to the presence, prevalence, and intensity of anxiety and depression. And especially as they corrected for lifestyle and things like that, what they found was that there was only one biomarker that was the most predictive of the onset and development of anxiety and depression. And this was all the way through to the 9-year follow-up. and that was the blood LPS levels, the amount of endotoxin you had in your blood.
Oh.
And if you had elevated levels of LPS, your risk for anxiety and depression was very high. And no matter what you changed about your lifestyle, no matter what medications you took, no matter what you did, if LPS levels remained high, you always had anxiety and depression. And for the people that saw an alleviation of their anxiety and depression, it coincided with a reduction in LPS levels, right? And in fact, it's so correlated, so well correlated, that they can predict the severity of your anxiety and depression on a defined scale based on how much LPS you have in your system, right? So it's causing inflammation in the brain. It's causing an activation of the HPA axis. It's causing an inability to utilize your happy hormone and your reward center hormone, dopamine. So it causes memory loss, confusion, low cognitive function, anxiety, depression, and so on, right? So then how is it connected to neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's? This is the scarier part, but keep in mind that you could do a lot about all of this, right? So it's not all doom and gloom. If you have a messed up gut, you're not producing enough serotonin and dopamine, your gut is leaky. You're also thereby not producing enough of something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor. BDNF is actually produced in the gut and is a very important compound in repairing the damage to the brain from that day's worth of activity, right? So when you go to sleep and all the housekeeping genes in your body turns on to repair things that got damaged throughout the day, one of the things that activates is a production of BDNF. BDNF goes to the brain and starts repairing all of the neurological damage that has occurred throughout the day so that you wake up the next morning with the same brain you had the day before. If your gut is messed up, you're not producing enough BDNF, so you're not effectively repairing the brain every night, right? So you wake up the next morning with a brain that's slightly more damaged than the day before. And as this goes on day after day after day, at some point the damage and the inflammation becomes profound enough where you start seeing symptoms of actual dementia, Alzheimer's, and so on, right? So that's the connection there. And that becomes very real for a lot of people in their mid to late 40s and 50s, right? People start to experience these massive mood swings, changes in tolerance level of things like annoyances that would normally you just let it roll off your back. You can't tolerate those things anymore. And then it also disrupts your sleep and all kinds of cognitive function.
Yeah, what you're saying is just mind-blowing. It's so important for everybody. First of all, I don't even understand why that's not on every billboard. Like, why aren't we just posting this information everywhere? It's wild that so many people still don't know what an impact the microbiome has on our brain and, well, so many parts. But also, what really hit me is this is important for everybody, but especially, I mean, this is who I work with. So, of course, I see it through this lens, but especially in midlife when those decreasing hormones again change our interaction with neurotransmitters. They change our brain chemistry. Like so much is wonky that if our microbiome is also wonky, it's just like a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Where instead, if we have that super diverse microbiome that's helping, then it buffers everything else.
It
It's mind
does.
blowing. It's just wild.
Yeah, and then the other thing that goes hand in hand with the microbiome is the liver, right? So the gut and the liver are partners in crime in terms of protecting and filtering things that are entering into the body. And they work very closely together, right? And one of the things we start to see is a dramatic increase in things like fatty liver disease in women that are hitting their menopausal stage. And so when the liver is dysfunctional, it further affects the gut microbiome because one of the key components of from the liver that actually controls microbial growth in the gut is the production of bile. So bile not only negates the overgrowth of dysfunctional bacteria, but then bile is metabolized by certain bacteria in the gut into these bile acids that actually feed beneficial bacteria. So bile from the liver plays a very important role in maintaining a healthy gut microbiome. But as your gut becomes leaky, the first thing that takes the biggest hit is your liver, because your liver is trying to filter all these endotoxins that are rushing into your system. The liver becomes dysfunctional, becomes fatty, stops producing as much bile. Your bile acid pool shrinks. That causes more dysbiosis in the gut, more endotoxemia, more damage to the liver, and the cycle keeps continuing, right? We don't address enough as women are starting perimenopause, going through it, going through menopause, how important it is to have a laser focus on improving the gut and improving and supporting the liver, right? Those are two things that cannot be overlooked. And often, if the symptoms aren't primarily digestive, they're not necessarily thinking about the gut, right? And it's very hard to get anyone to think about their liver because it's the unsung hero in the body. It's doing so many things, and it's taking the brunt of the hit of toxicity. And once the liver starts becoming dysfunctional, everything else starts to fall apart as well.
I'm just over here smiling to hear you say this because this is what I teach in my women's hormone group, the importance of taking care of your microbiome and your liver. And it is hard to explain to people like why I'm wasting my time on that when it really is just so foundational
Yeah.
for health and hormone health. So thank you for that. And you've shared so much with us, Kiran. I'm so grateful for your time. I'm so grateful for your research and your amazing ability to explain these complex systems with people. Is there anything you want to share about? I would love to be here for another 2 hours, but anything else you'd like to share about the microbiome through this lens before we sign off?
Yeah. I think one of the most important things that certainly women in midlife and everybody needs to be thinking about is how to diversify your gut microbiome, right? If I were to lay out a few tips of how you think about doing that, they would be the following. Number one is increasing fiber in your diet. Fiber is arguably the most important macronutrient to think about, and in fact has huge impacts in your overall health. So, for example, there's been a number of meta-analysis study, including a recent one from about 3 years ago, where that involved almost 1 million subjects in the meta-analysis study. And what they showed was for every 10 grams of fiber that you add to your daily diet, you reduce mortality risk by 11%, right? And that's because, and keep in mind, we don't utilize the fiber at all. Our system doesn't, we can't break down fiber. It's all going to feed the microbiome. And thereby, what they're really saying is that by enhancing the diversity and growth of the microbiome and feeding the microbiome, you're reducing your risk of mortality and chronic disease, right? And so fiber is really important. I try to get around 50 to 60 grams of fiber per day between soluble and insoluble fiber. I supplement about 25 grams of that. And I try to get at least 25, 30 grams from the diet. And so that's something for people to really keep in mind, especially in midlife. The second part of it is using a good probiotic. We worked for years with the spore-based probiotics. What I liked about the spore-based probiotic is that it has a way of affecting the growth of dysfunctional bacteria in the gut microbiome. So it can bring down dysfunctional microbes and increase the growth of beneficial bacteria, right? So that can be very powerful. Diversifying your diet and increasing your intake of polyphenols. Polyphenols are an amazing food for your microbiome. And in fact, it feeds really important microbes like Akkermansia, for example. And polyphenols are converted into something called urolithins, which then affect all the mitochondria in your body and a lot of the cells in your body as well. So intake of polyphenols becomes really important as well. And then getting outside in nature, right? And getting exposed to things like the natural environment, to dirt, to trees and bushes and shrubs and all that stuff. All of that enhances the diversity of your microbiome. And finally, the last thing would be stress management. Stress has one of the most potent negative impacts on your microbiome. And so whatever you can do, mindfulness work, relaxation, whatever it takes to try to manage stress in your life, it becomes really important for your microbiome and thereby for your overall health. So people can keep those few things in mind. And if you do them all, there's a dramatic additive effect that really can revamp what your ecosystem looks like.
Those are awesome tips. Thank you for those. And where can people find you?
Reach out to me on Instagram at kiranbiome.com. So that's not .com, but at kiranbiome, KIRAN, BIOME. I'm on Facebook as well as Kiran Krishan. And I do try to engage with people, directly as much as I can. I get a lot of messages and all that on social media, but I think there's a lot of value in answering people's questions and providing them some direction. So I try to do that as much as I can. So reach out on there, and I'm constantly posting things that hopefully are practical and useful for people to think about.
Yeah, you do amazing work. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you so much for being here. I am
My
grateful.
pleasure.
Yeah, bye-bye. That's it for this week. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a comment and a review, as that helps it reach more people. You can find me and the courses I teach, the Midlife Hormone Club and the Energy Club, online at Mountain Rebalance. I help midlife women understand their body and age better. If that sounds like you, please join my newsletter. And if there's a topic you'd like me to cover here or an expert you want me to have on, let me know. In the meantime, keep playing, and here's to aging our best.